The Zephyrian Empire had built its reputation on a rather simple philosophy: might makes right, and if you couldn't crush a boulder with your bare hands, you probably weren't worth the oxygen you consumed. It was a delightfully straightforward approach to galactic politics, one that had served them well for roughly 3,000 years of interstellar expansion. Their warriors stood 9 feet tall on average, possessed enough raw strength to bend starship hull plating, and maintained a cultural obsession with displays of physical dominance that would make ancient gladiators weep with envy. Commander Vexthal Korath embodied this philosophy with the sort of dedication typically reserved for religious fanatics. Standing at an impressive 10.5 feet, with chitinous armor plating that had evolved specifically to intimidate lesser species, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by applying sufficient force in the correct direction. His posting to Nexus Station, the galaxy's premier neutral trading hub, was supposed to be a diplomatic assignment. The keyword being supposed. Nexus Station itself was an engineering marvel that somehow managed to remain standing despite hosting every conceivable species in the known galaxy, most of whom harbored ancient grudges against at least half of the others. The station's designers had clearly possessed either remarkable optimism or devastating sense of humor, creating a space where the galaxy's most violent civilizations were expected to conduct peaceful commerce. That it worked at all was testament to the universal language of profit margins and the strategic placement of some truly impressive defensive systems. The biological hierarchy that governed interactions on Nexus Station was as rigid as it was absurd. At the top sat species like the Zephyrians and their various warrior caste allies, whose evolutionary paths had prioritized raw physical power above all else. Below them ranked the more cerebral species, valued for their technological contributions, but always reminded of their place in the food chain. And at the very bottom, barely registering as a footnote in most galactic affairs, sat humanity. Humans had been a galactic joke for the better part of 2 centuries. Oh, they tried to make themselves useful. Their technology wasn't completely worthless, and they showed a peculiar knack for fixing problems that had stumped more advanced civilizations. But physically, they were laughably fragile. No natural armor, no enhanced strength, no evolutionary adaptations that marked them as anything more than particularly clever prey animals. The fact that they had somehow developed faster-than-light travel before destroying themselves was considered one of the universe's more amusing accidents. This morning's entertainment promised to be particularly rich. A human delegation had requested an audience with the Zephyrian Trade Consortium, something about securing mining rights to rare earth minerals that humanity apparently needed for their quaint little colonial expansion project. The request alone had generated considerable amusement among the station's more established powers. Humans, trying to negotiate with Zephyrians. It was like watching a house pet attempt to intimidate a hurricane. Commander Vexthal had agreed to the meeting primarily because he found human desperation entertaining. Their species had this endearing habit of clinging to hope long past the point of rational acceptance, and watching that hope gradually transform into dawning horror never got old. Plus, the Trade Consortium had been unusually boring lately. Nothing but routine negotiations with species who understood their place in the galactic order. A bit of comic relief would be welcome. The human delegation arrived precisely on time, which Vexthal found mildly surprising. Most species learned to show up early when dealing with Zephyrians, as a mark of respect and acknowledgement of their inferior status. Arriving exactly when scheduled suggested either remarkable confidence or stunning ignorance. Given humanity's reputation, he suspected the latter. Captain Zara Blackwood entered the trading floor with a sort of measured composure that immediately marked her as either supremely confident or completely unaware of the danger she faced. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, practically a dwarf by galactic standards, with the pale, soft features that marked humans as obviously unsuited for physical confrontation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that suggested functionality over intimidation, and her simple uniform bore none of the elaborate displays of strength that serious species used to establish their credentials. She was, in other words, exactly what Vexthal had expected, another example of humanity's persistent delusion that intelligence could somehow compensate for obvious physical inadequacy. "Commander Korath," she said, offering what humans apparently considered a respectful nod. Her voice carried no trace of the nervous tremor that usually marked first encounters with Zephyrian authority. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Vexthal allowed himself a moment to appreciate the absurdity of the situation. This tiny creature was thanking him for the privilege of being humiliated in front of half the station's trading community. The irony was delicious. "Captain Blackwood," he replied, his voice carrying the sort of casual dismissal that had reduced hardened warriors to nervous silence. "I must admit, I'm curious to see what humanity believes it can offer the Zephyrian Empire. Your species has shown a remarkable talent for overestimating its own capabilities." The observation drew appreciative chuckles from the assembled crowd. Representatives from dozens of species had gathered to witness what promised to be either a spectacular negotiation or an even more spectacular humiliation. The smart money was definitely on the latter. Blackwood's expression remained perfectly neutral, which Vexthal found mildly disappointing. He preferred his victims to show at least a flicker of intimidation before the real fun began. "We're prepared to offer exclusive mining rights to several systems rich in rare earth elements," she said, producing a datapad with a sort of efficiency that suggested she actually believed this negotiation might succeed. The deposits include significant quantities of trilithium, quantum crystals, and refined neutronium compounds. The offer was, admittedly, more substantial than Vexthal had expected. Those materials were genuinely valuable, and securing exclusive access would represent a significant coup for the Empire. Unfortunately for Captain Blackwood, the value of her offer only made the upcoming humiliation more delicious. "Interesting," he said, accepting the datapad with one massive claw. The device disappeared entirely in his grasp, looking like a child's toy in comparison to his scaled appendages. Of course, any serious negotiation requires a demonstration of worthiness. The Empire doesn't conduct business with species that lack the strength to honor their commitments. This was the moment Vexthal had been waiting for. The challenge of worthiness was a time-honored Zephyrian tradition, designed to weed out the weak and establish proper hierarchical relationships. Most species understood the implications immediately: prove your physical prowess, or be dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. The crowd stirred with anticipation. Everyone knew how these demonstrations typically went when humans were involved. There would be awkward fumbling, obvious terror, and eventually a humiliating retreat as the humans realized they had no business dealing with their betters. "What sort of demonstration did you have in mind?" Blackwood asked, and Vexthal had to admire her commitment to maintaining dignity in the face of inevitable disaster. "Something appropriate to your capabilities," he said, allowing his mandibles to spread in what most species recognized as a predatory grin. "Perhaps you could attempt to move this." He gestured toward a standard cargo container sitting nearby, a modest cube of reinforced metal that happened to weigh approximately 3 tons when empty. It was the sort of casual test that most serious species could handle without breaking a sweat, but which would be utterly impossible for human physiology. The crowd's anticipation was almost palpable. This was a moment when human pretensions would collide with physical reality, and everyone wanted to witness the spectacular failure that would inevitably follow. Blackwood walked over to the container with the sort of measured pace that suggested she was actually taking the challenge seriously. She circled it once, examining the construction with a sort of attention to detail that might have been admirable in other circumstances. "Hey, it simply looked like desperate stalling." "Interesting design," she murmured, running her fingers along the container surface. "Standard Nexus Station cargo unit, reinforced polymer construction over a trilithium steel frame. Weight distribution suggests approximately 3.2 tons when empty." Her casual assessment of the container's specifications drew a few surprised murmurs from the crowd. Most species would have attempted to move the thing immediately, relying on brute force to achieve the desired result. Humans, apparently, felt compelled to analyze everything first. "Very thorough," Vexthal said, making no attempt to hide his amusement. "Unfortunately, analysis doesn't move cargo. Perhaps you'd like to attempt the actual challenge." What happened next defied every expectation the assembled crowd had developed over centuries of dealing with humanity. Instead of attempting to lift, push, or otherwise physically manipulate the container, Blackwood pulled out a small device that looked remarkably like a standard personal communicator. She pressed several buttons in rapid succession, and the container suddenly began to glow with a soft blue radiance. "Gravitational field manipulation," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Humans developed the technology about 50 years ago, but we've been improving the efficiency. This particular unit can reduce effective mass by approximately 97% while maintaining structural integrity. The container rose slowly into the air, rotating gently as it floated 3 feet above the deck plating. Blackwood guided it through a series of complex maneuvers with casual gestures, making the 3-ton object dance through the air like a child's balloon. The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with mass extinctions or the heat death of the universe. Of course, Blackwood continued, as if she hadn't just casually violated several fundamental assumptions about human capabilities, we found that most species focus so heavily on raw physical strength that they overlook more elegant solutions to common problems. She lowered the container back to its original position with a sort of precision that suggested she could have threaded it through a needle if necessary. The gravitational field dissipated, and the container settled back onto the deck with a solid thunk that emphasized just how impressive the preceding demonstration had been. Neat trick, Vexthal said, fighting to keep his voice level. The casual dismissal he'd intended came out sounding more like grudging respect, which was not at all the tone he'd been aiming for. "Oh, that's just the basic model," Blackwood replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was enjoying herself far more than the situation seemed to warrant. "We've developed some truly interesting applications for the technology. Would you like to see?" Before Vexthal could formulate a response that didn't sound like either obvious stalling or outright panic, Blackwood had activated several more devices. The air around the cargo container began to shimmer with what looked suspiciously like an energy field. "Selective gravity manipulation," she explained, as the container began to compress itself into impossible shapes. "By creating localized fields of varying intensity, we can reshape virtually any material without applying direct physical force. It's particularly useful for mining operations. Instead of blasting through our deposits and hoping for the best, we can extract specific minerals without disturbing the surrounding matrix." The container folded itself into an intricate sculpture that somehow managed to maintain its structural integrity despite being twisted into configurations that should have been physically impossible. Then, with another casual gesture from Blackwood, it unfolded itself back into its original cubic form. The demonstration was undeniably impressive, but Vexthal wasn't ready to concede defeat just yet. After all, technological tricks were all well and good, but they didn't address the fundamental question of human worthiness. "Very clever," he said, putting enough condescension into his tone to make it clear that he wasn't particularly impressed by humanity's tendency to substitute gadgets for genuine capability. "Unfortunately, technology has a tendency to fail at inconvenient moments. What happens when your clever little devices break down?" It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of humanity's fundamental weakness. They relied on tools because they lacked the inherent capabilities that marked truly superior species. Remove those tools, and they reverted to being exactly what they appeared to be: soft, fragile creatures with delusions of adequacy. "An excellent point," Blackwood said, and proceeded to do something that redefined Vexthal's understanding of human psychology. She smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile of someone trying to maintain composure in the face of superior force. It wasn't the desperate smile of someone hoping to charm their way out of an impossible situation. It was the sort of smile that suggested she knew something that everyone else in the room had missed and was looking forward to sharing that knowledge. "Let me show you what happens when human technology fails," she said, setting her gravitational manipulator aside with the sort of careful precision that suggested it was, indeed, quite valuable. What followed was a masterclass in applied physics that would have impressed university professors and terrified military strategists in equal measure. Blackwood walked back to the cargo container and began her examination again, but this time her movements carried a different quality. Where before she had been analytical, now she was purposeful. She identified stress points in the container's construction, traced load-bearing elements, and examined the junction points where different materials had been fused together. "The thing about human weakness," she said, running her fingers along what appeared to be a completely unremarkable section of the container's frame, "is that it's forced us to become very good at finding weaknesses in other things." She pressed her thumb against a specific point on the container's surface, applying what looked like minimal pressure. There was a sharp crack, and suddenly an entire panel of the container's sidewall was hanging loose, its structural integrity completely compromised. Resonance frequency manipulation, she explained conversationally. Every material has specific vibrational frequencies that can cause structural failure. Humans have gotten quite good at identifying and exploiting those frequencies. She moved to another section of the container and repeated the process, this time using what appeared to be a simple tapping motion with her knuckles. Another panel separated from the main structure, falling to the deck with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet trading floor. Of course, you don't always need to know the exact frequency, she continued, apparently unaware that she had reduced a room full of experienced traders and hardened warriors to stunned silence. Sometimes you can achieve similar results through targeted application of force to structural weak points. The demonstration that followed was simultaneously educational and deeply unsettling. Within the span of 10 minutes, Blackwood had systematically disassembled the 3-ton cargo container using nothing but her bare hands and an apparently encyclopedic knowledge of material science. She didn't break the container so much as convince it to take itself apart, each piece separating cleanly from the whole as if the entire structure had been designed to come apart on command. The fascinating thing about strength, she said, standing amidst the neatly arranged components of what had once been a solid cargo container, is that it's often less important than knowing exactly where and how to apply it. She picked up one of the container's support struts, a piece of reinforced metal that would have required significant effort for even a Zephyrian to bend, and demonstrated the principle by snapping it cleanly in half at what was apparently a critical stress point. Humans have never been the strongest species in the galaxy, she continued, setting the broken strut aside with a sort of casual precision that suggested this was a routine demonstration rather than an impossible feat, but we've gotten very good at making strength irrelevant. The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with the moment when everyone in the room simultaneously realizes they've been thinking about the problem completely wrong. Vexthal stared at the neatly disassembled cargo container, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The human hadn't used superior strength to overcome the challenge. She had made the challenge itself irrelevant through the application of knowledge and technique. It was a fundamentally different approach to problem solving, one that suggested humans might be far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Impressive, he said finally, because even Zephyrian arrogance had its limits when confronted with evidence that fundamental assumptions might be wrong. Though I'm curious how such techniques might apply to more personal encounters. It was a last-ditch attempt to salvage something from the situation, and everyone in the room knew it. The challenge was clear. Impressive as a demonstration had been, could the human actually defend herself against a superior opponent? Blackwood's smile took on a quality that managed to be simultaneously pleasant and absolutely terrifying. I'm glad you asked, she said. What happened next would be discussed in trading posts and military academies for decades to come. Vexthal launched himself forward with a sort of devastating speed that had made Zephyrian warriors legendary throughout the galaxy. His massive frame moved with predatory grace, claws extended, mandibles spread in a display of pure aggression that should have reduced any reasonable opponent to paralyzed terror. Blackwood stepped aside. It wasn't an elegant dodge or desperate scramble for safety. It was a single, economical movement that placed her exactly where Vexthal wasn't going to be, executed with the sort of timing that suggested she had known exactly what he was going to do before he did it. Vexthal's charge carried him past her and directly into the space where the cargo container had been sitting moments before. His claws scraped against the deck plating as he fought to arrest his momentum, and he spun around to face his opponent with a sort of frustrated rage that marked a predator realizing its prey might not be as helpless as expected. Predictable, Blackwood observed, circling him with the sort of casual confidence that suggested she was conducting an academic exercise rather than fighting for her life. Zephyrian combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force applied along the most direct vector to the target. It's very effective against opponents who try to match your strength, but it has some interesting vulnerabilities. Vexthal snarled and launched another attack, this time attempting to corner his opponent against the trading floor's bulkhead. The strategy was sound: eliminate her mobility, then use superior reach and strength to end the confrontation quickly. Blackwood ducked under his grasping claws, stepped inside his guard, and did something with her elbow that sent paralyzing pain shooting up Vexthal's primary manipulator arm. The limb went completely numb, hanging useless at his side as his nervous system tried to process what had just happened. Nerve clusters, she explained, dancing away from his retaliatory strike with infuriating ease. Every species has them, and they are usually located in predictable anatomical positions. Humans have had to get very good at finding them, since we can't rely on superior strength to win confrontations. The fight that followed was less a battle than a systematic demonstration of everything that was wrong with Zephyrian assumptions about combat effectiveness. Every attack Vexthal launched was anticipated, redirected, or simply avoided through minimal effort. Meanwhile, Blackwood's responses were precisely targeted to exploit physiological vulnerabilities that he hadn't even known he possessed. She didn't try to overpower him. That would have been impossible given the vast difference in their physical capabilities. Instead, she systematically disabled his ability to fight back, targeting nerve clusters, pressure points, and joint articulations with surgical precision. Each strike was calculated to produce maximum disruption with minimal effort, leaving Vexthal increasingly frustrated and less capable of mounting effective offense. The final insult came when she somehow managed to use his own momentum against him, sending the 10-and-a-half-foot warrior crashing to the deck in a tangle of limbs that would have been comedic if it hadn't been so definitively humiliating. "The thing about being weak," Blackwood said, standing over his sprawled form with her hands clasped behind her back in a pose that somehow managed to be both respectful and utterly dismissive, "is that it forces you to get creative." She looked up at the assembled crowd, her expression returning to the sort of professional pleasantness that marked serious business negotiations. "Now then," she said, as if the preceding demonstration had been a minor interruption rather than a complete redefinition of human capabilities, about those mining rights. "I believe we were discussing terms." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Vexthal attempting to regain both his footing and his dignity. The crowd of onlookers seemed frozen in place, as if their cognitive processes had encountered a logical paradox too complex to resolve. "The Zephyrian Empire," Vexthal said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, "would be honored to discuss terms with humanity." The negotiation that followed was notable primarily for its brevity and the extremely favorable terms that somehow ended up in humanity's favor. It seemed that witnessing their champion reduced to an undignified heap by a creature half his size had given the Zephyrian delegation a new perspective on the relative value of human partnership. As Captain Blackwood prepared to leave Nexus Station with signed agreements that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before, she paused to offer one final observation to the still stunned crowd. "Strength," she said, "isn't about how much force you can apply. It's about knowing when, where, and how to apply whatever force you have available." She smiled one last time, that same mysteriously pleasant expression that had preceded the systematic demolition of everything the galactic community thought it knew about human capabilities. "We may not be the strongest species in the galaxy," she continued, "but we've gotten very good at making that irrelevant." And with that, she walked away, leaving behind a trading floor full of beings who were suddenly, urgently interested in reassessing their assumptions about the nature of strength, the value of intelligence, and the inadvisability of underestimating species that appeared to be weak. Commander Vexthal, still nursing bruises that would take weeks to heal, watched her go and reflected on the painful lesson he'd just learned about the difference between appearing strong and actually being dangerous. It was, he realized, a distinction that might prove crucial in the years to come, as humanity began to assert its place in a galactic order that had been built on assumptions that were rapidly proving to be incomplete at best and catastrophically wrong at worst. The universe, it seemed, was about to become a much more interesting place.